Start with the Conservatives, Joe. Not an easy issue for them, of course. We all recall David Cameron's pledge to reduce to the tens of thousands net migration by the end of this Parliament. It's a target they missed, and by some distance. But they're still talking tough, and this is the flagship policy. They want to freeze benefits for migrants who've not been here for 4 years. That's out-of-work and in-work benefits, so things like tax credits and social housing. And that would form part of a renegotiation with the EU, tightening up the rules on the freedom of movement. It's not an easy issue either for the Labour Party. Do we recall that memo that was sent out which seemed to advise candidates and MPs not to talk about immigration on the doorstep? Well, they are now talking tough. They're talking about 1,000 new border staff, proper entry and exit checks. Of course, exit checks were being phased in yesterday. And they also want to freeze benefits, but only for those who haven't been here for 2 years and only on out-of-work benefits. So not as far as the Conservatives. The Lib Dems standing somewhere in between. They would, again, restore full entry and exit border checks to see who is leaving. And they'd also freeze child benefits, so benefits for those dependents living outside of the UK. Now, does Nigel Farage want a target or not? He seems to think net migration should be somewhere between 15 and 50,000. This Australian-based point system is their flagship policy to select the migrants with the right sort of skill set that would benefit the UK economy. And they go further, in fact, on benefits. They would freeze them for up to 5 years. And really, it's only the Greens, Joe, perhaps alongside the SNP, who have this more open-door policy on immigration, more rights for asylum seekers, and no sign of that Australian-based point system here.
Right, Christian, so we've gone through the party's policies. Can you take us through the numbers? Talking about immigration, how much of a big deal in statistical terms is immigration?
Well, let's talk about some big numbers. This was the number of foreign-born people living in Great Britain in 1993. 20 years later, it had jumped to this. It had more than doubled to 7.8 million. To the year September 2014, 624,000 people came from overseas, from outside the UK. And of that number, 40% of them were from within the EU and 47% from outside, from the rest of the world. This is a figure, incidentally, that is growing. Now, that looks like a big figure, 624,000. But, of course, what we're looking at is net migration. And I just want to finish with this graph, Joe. It looks complicated, but it shows you the number of people coming in on the top line. This blue line is the number of people from outside that are leaving. And it's that we're looking at. That is the net margin, the net migration, represented by these green blocks here. You can see it started to dip towards the beginning of 2012, but then it rises to 298,000 in February. And that is almost at the peak we have over here. This is 2005, New Labour's second term, and that was a year after EU expansion. So lots there in the figures for your guests in the studio to discuss.
Christian, thank you very much. Well, joining UKIP's Patrick O'Flynn here in the studio is the Deputy Leader of the Green Party, Shahrar Ali. Welcome to the Daily
Hello.
Politics. One of your campaign mugs, I think we can show it up on the screen, proudly states, standing up for migrants. So is the Green Party advocating uncontrolled immigration to Britain?
We do believe in there being some controls, certainly in the short to medium term, although we are a more liberal, progressive, I would say, party in terms of the benefits of migration and putting it in context. Because really what's happened is that all the mainstream parties have tried to out UKIP. And we feel as if this rhetoric is very toxic, it's very damaging for race relations, and we rail against that. And so we are standing up for migrants. We want to reduce the amount of migration that people feel compelled to have to do because of living in war-torn areas. So we need to look at foreign policy across the piece.
Right. I mean, that's a long-term aim,
yes.
If you like. Looking at it now and over the period of the next Parliament, would you say no to anybody coming into the country, or would you have, in effect, an open-door policy?
Our long-term aspiration is to reduce the amount of controls, whether you want to call it open door or open borders. We feel as though there is what hasn't actually been picked up already is that we've got about 5 million Britons living overseas, nearly 2 million, 1.8 of which living in the European Union, and 2.3 million coming into the UK from the European Union. So that net amount, that difference, if you will, is not that large, and we think that we can cope with those numbers.
What sort of number? Sorry, what sort of number is that? What net
2.34 minus 1.8,
right.
500,000 extra coming into this country
every year.
That's the current levels, differential. But the reason we can't put a we're against putting an arbitrary cap. And the reason is because we're in favour of free movement.
Right.
And so we can't have it both ways. If suddenly another 500,000 a year want to go into the European Union, the UK, Britons want to go there, they can do that.
Yes, OK, but 500,000 is about the figure that the Green Party says this country can cope with.
It's tolerable,
right.
And also we welcome it. That's the main difference.
Right, it's
we
tolerable,
don't treat them as a
and
problem, we treat them as an opportunity.
Can you clarify UKIP's policy? Because we have had problems trying to get a straight answer on the numbers, because UKIP obviously have made immigration a keystone of your manifesto policy, whatever your offer. But you haven't been clear on exactly what you would do in terms of numbers. You are saying there would be no net migration target at all.
Well, very quickly, can I congratulate Shahrar for honestly espousing an immigration policy that's compatible with EU membership, because that's effectively the Lib Lab Com policy, but they pretend it's not. The Greens
well, let's
are
see if we can
being honest. Yeah, so let's talk about
you on
UKIP's policy.
On
There's been a confusion, which I ascribe to most of it to the media, between two different things, right? Net migration cannot conceptually be capped unless you aspire to be 1970s Albania or North Korea.
Right, any so government there's no net migration target.
Listen,
that's fine.
If I can just continue. Any government can only control one side of the equation. That's the incomers. But net migration is not unimportant, because how high it is has an impact on things like housing, pressure on public services. So we would aspire to get back to normality on net migration, which typically was 30 to 50,000 a year. It's not a cap, right? We believe our key offering is we are the party of much lower immigration, right? And our key #1 measure for that is a 5-year ban on unskilled migration into Britain, right? Then there's a secondary policy, which is the Australian point star system for skilled migrants. Now, under that, there would be an annual cap,
and what would that be?
Of 50,000
a maximum
a year,
of 50,000
right?
on your point system.
So there are two different 50,000s here. There's a 30 to 50,000, which is normality, we think, on net migration, but you cannot control net migration in terms of a cap, because you're only in charge of one side of the equation.
That doesn't matter, that figure, does it?
Well, I've already explained it does, in the sense that net migration is not irrelevant. It governs a lot to do with the pressures on a society. So we think our policy of lowering the side of the equation we're in charge of, because we would leave the EU and end freedom of movement. That's the key. We would drastically lower immigration to Britain.
You say you drastically lower immigration, but I spoke to Suzanne Evans about a week ago. You would have this commission, and we did have a debate about whether or not that figure could rise. That figure could rise to, let's say, up to 100,000, and you would be happy to accept that. If they said that was the demand of the economy, you'd be happy.
Not for the course of the next Parliament.
Right.
Because the rate of immigration has been so high and put Britain under so much pressure. We would hold a cap of 50,000 under the Australian points system route into the country for work.
Right, so we have got a cap. So we've got a 50,000 cap on your Australian points-based system of the skilled workers that you would come in, for people from both the EU and outside the EU. I mean, the whole world outside of Britain.
And of course ours is the truly non-racist policy, because we put every citizen of every other country on a level footing when we judge what they can bring to Britain.
Even if the economy demands that we need 70,000?
Well, we don't agree that the economy remotely demands
what's
that.
the point of having this commission that will be telling you? Suzanne Evans said it will be the Migration
Control Commission, I suppose a bit like the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, will work to a remit which will be set by politicians.
So there is a cap. So there's a cap. There's a 50,000 cap, and that will be the remit of the
immigration under the
Australian
system.
Well, that's much clearer than we've heard up until now. What do you say to that?
Well, I think there are a lot of myths being peddled and betrayed even now. The thing is, there are lots of streams of migration. Firstly, we've got refugees. We have international obligations towards those, and they're being treated deplorably due to the politics of fear. We have international students. Even if you look at public attitudes towards international students, they're far more welcome of those people. And we would say that they should be entitled to stay 2 years after graduation, and they can input into the economy, if you want to put it like that as well. Then we've got economic migration. Admittedly, a lot of that is not forced. You know, people from the EU looking for a better way of living. We would accommodate those people. But the trouble is, firstly, they're not driving down wages as such. We've got information about that. We've only got 15% less people, actually, than UK citizens, which actually be applying for those benefits.
Right. Well, I must let Patrick answer this.
They are driving down wages.
And what's the evidence?
Well, the evidence, as you will have read the Treasury Select Committee report into the autumn statement, where a string of very senior economists were saying it has caused wage compression, particularly among unskilled and semi-skilled workers. I don't think that's under dispute anymore by serious economists.
Do you not realise what you're doing to race relations in this country?
I'm trying to improve race relations.
You are not, because you are scapegoating migrants.
Not at all.
The difficulty with the public service...
One at a time. You go, Shahrar, and then
The difficulty
Patrick.
with the public services, whether you look at health, education, housing, is there has been a systematic crisis in funding, investment. It's the richest who are getting richer in this country due to the austerity measures, and the poorest are getting more vulnerable.
Patrick, just
street,
respond.
food banks, you name it.
Well, we have a 90
Migrants are not
billion.
responsible for that.
We still have a 90 billion public sector deficit. I think we've demonstrated beyond doubt that bringing in unskilled migrants, even if they go into work, makes that deficit worse because their tax contribution is minimal, their public service consumption and in-work benefit bill is considerable.
OK, I'm going to have to leave it there. Shahrar Ali, thank you.
Thank you.